The second labor union that you need to know is the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. The AFL was founded in 1886 by this guy, Samuel Gompers. And the AFL was very, very different from the Knights of Labor. Remember, I said that the Knights of Labor would actively recruit all members, craft workers and unskilled workers, women, minorities, all sorts of people. This was a craft union, so you had to have a skill, so a blacksmith or a steel worker or something like that. It was basically sort of a combination of over 100 smaller local trades unions. They had really high dues to assist workers who were in need, or when workers were on a strike, which is a good system, but they did not really have enough members to effectively keep that up for a long period of time. Now, this union had the nickname of the Bread and Butter Union because they were targeting specific reforms that would help employees right now, like shorter working hours and better pay, as opposed to the Knights of Labor, who were working for those longer term reforms that would favor the working class. Now, they weren't very welcoming to minorities, and they flat out excluded women, so they weren't as successful. They didn't have as many members as the Knights of Labor did. So, as I mentioned before, strikes are going to be the most common way for a labor union to sort of try to push a company or corporation into making some changes that help employees, but strikes can easily turn into violent events. So they always have a very big impact, whether they're successful or not, on the business, the government, and then the union strikers, or the union the strikers represent. So like I said, I mean, we see protests in the news a little more often lately, and we see how easily those things can turn into riots and violent events, and strikes are very similar. So we're going to talk about 3 strikes. The first is the Haymarket Riot, definitely the most famous strike possibly to ever happen, but definitely during this time the most famous strike. So on May 1st of 1886, thousands of workers all over the country staged a national demonstration for an 8-hour workday, and this had been organized by the Knights of Labor. They had been working on this 8-hour workday thing. It happened in several cities, and a couple of these events erupted in violence. For example, at the McCormick plant in Chicago, a couple of guys got shot. A couple of strikers were shot by police officers. So they called off the whole strike. They were like, let's not do this right now. We need to get back on track. So the Knights of Labor over the next couple of days are thinking, how can we get everyone focused and working towards this 8-hour workday goal without allowing this to become a violent event. So they decide that they want to hold a second sort of protest movement thing on May 4th. So just a couple of days later. This is in Chicago. So they meet on May 4th. This is a Tuesday, in Haymarket Square, which is like I said, they're in Chicago, and they've got this pretty big crowd of several hundred people are out there. It's not violent. It's just sort of a regular sort of movement type situation. They got some guys speaking. The mayor is there. There's a fairly heavy police presence because of what had gone on the couple of days before. They wanted to make sure that everything was going to turn out okay. The mayor, like I said, the mayor's there. He sees everything going on, and he's like, you know what? I feel like everything is okay. I don't need to be here. So the mayor leaves. Another guy gets up and starts to speak, and he starts mentioning the guys who had gotten killed at the McCormick plant a few days before that. And that's when the crowd starts to get a little riled up. They're thinking about their friends who had just been killed by these police officers. And people start to get a little crazy. So the police are like, all right. Things are getting out of hand. Let's all go home. Let's just call this, off, and everybody chill out. And right then, someone throws a bomb and immediately kills a police officer, and all hell breaks loose. I'm sure you can imagine. And it just, morphs into a full-blown riot. By the end of it all, 7 police officers and 4 civilians were killed in total. So obviously the Knights of Labor are sort of directly implicated in this, not because they have any history of violence or bomb making, but they were the ones who organized this particular event. So it really makes them look bad. So over the next several days, it's essentially martial law in Chicago. The police presence is very heavy there, because police officers were killed in the line of duty. There's always a lot more pressure on the department to close the case very quickly. So like I mentioned before, the connection between socialists and communists to the labor movement, there are also a fair amount of anarchists involved in labor unions as well. An anarchist is someone who believes we should have no government at all. So, unfortunately, people like that can be targets for political scrutiny. And 8 anarchists who had been, some involved in the Knights of Labor, some not, were arrested and charged and convicted of conspiracy. Absolutely none of them were responsible for throwing the bomb, and there was no evidence that any of them were responsible for throwing that bomb. The trials ended up being so much more about, their political beliefs, socialism, communism, anarchy, than actual evidence about the bombing. So of those 8, 7 of them got the death penalty. 1 had gotten 15 years in prison. So of the 7 that got the death penalty, 2 of their death sentences were reduced to life in prison. So 5 left on death row. 1 of them committed suicide before his execution. And then the remaining 4 were hung and executed on November 11th of 1887. Now, several years later, in 1893, the governor of Illinois at the time pardoned the 2 guys that were left in prison, the 3 guys that were left in prison, and criticized the whole trial, basically saying how it was a total sham and there had been no real evidence and we should all be ashamed. But people heard that, but they still blamed the Knights of Labor for all of this, and they saw them as a violent group, a group of anarchists, communists, and crazy people. So because of this, the Knights of Labor are basically going to die out, and there's always going to be a stressful connection between labor unions and companies in Illinois. People are going to start associating unions with violence and anarchy, and a lot more businesses are going to be cracking down on union involvement. The second strike is the Homestead Strike. This was in the summer of 1892 in Homestead, Pennsylvania, against the Carnegie Steel Company, against U.S. Steel. Carnegie had cut wages that summer. So in June, the AA, which is the Iron and Steel Workers Union, they called for a strike, and Carnegie put his partner sort of in charge of handling all of this, and that was Henry Frick. So Henry Frick called in a group called the Pinkertons, and they were brought in sort of as like a PI group, almost like a police unit for hire. They were brought in to break up the strike. Now there ends up sort of being this standoff between the Pinkertons and the strikers, and somehow the Pinkertons end up killing a couple of the strikers. So in July, one of the guys in the AA is wanting revenge. He's an anarchist, and he decides that our best bet is to assassinate Henry Frick. So when he tries to assassinate Henry Frick, he fails, but he's arrested, thrown in jail, and once again, it's like, here, look at all these crazy strikers who are anarchists and communists, and they're violent, and they just want to kill people. So the public started associating this strike once again with anarchy and violence, and they started seeing the Carnegie Company as the victims and the strikers as villains instead of the other way around. So by November, the AA had to call the whole thing off. And then the third strike is the Pullman strike, once again in Chicago. So this is a year after the governor had pardoned those guys for what had gone on in the Haymarket Riot and the sort of false convictions there. On May 11th of 1894 in Chicago, the Pullman Company, which made luxury train cars, Pullman cars, they laid off 4,000 employees, which is a massive layoff. And then on top of that, they cut wages of people who didn't get laid off by 25%. That is a huge income deduction. And a lot of these people were really going to struggle because of that. On top of that, to make matters worse, most of the people who worked for the Pullman Company lived in a company town. So now those 4,000 people that are out of a job are also out of a home. And those everyone else who had their wages cut by 25%, their rent did not get cut by 25%. So their costs remain the same, and they're forced to live there. They can't move anywhere else, but their wages have been cut. So this is just a really bad situation all around, but they don't have a union. So Eugene V. Debs, this guy on the far right, back in 1893, he had founded the American Railway Union, the ARU, and he had heard about when this happens in May of 94, he hears about what's going on in Chicago, and he's like, these guys, they need a union. There had been, tense relationships about unions and between unions and companies since the Haymarket Riot. That's why there was no union for the Pullman workers in Chicago. But Eugene V. Debs is like, no, they need someone to stick up for them. So he goes to Chicago and he organizes a strike for them. He calls for a strike, and he also calls for a boycott of all trains that pull a Pullman car, which is a lot. And because the American Railway Union, I'm sure you can imagine the railway industry is massive, so that union is very large as well. At its peak, the strike covered 27 states and over 250,000 workers. Riots occurred all over the place in many different cities. All in all, 30 people got killed during the Pullman strike, and they caused $80 million worth of property damage. Finally, this is one of those times where we would say this union is becoming a bad trust. They are in a negative way affecting the economy. So the government has got to interfere here and stop all of this. So our president at the time, Grover Cleveland, orders the strike to stop because it's interfering in trade and the economy. And he sends in the army to break up all the strikers. So the army goes in, they dissolve everything, they find Eugene V. Debs, they arrest him, and they convict him, and they put him in jail. And with no leader, the ARU, the American Railway Union, essentially sort of fizzles out because they don't have anyone. Now, the impact of all of this is that businesses and unions are going to continue to tangle over the next several decades, with lots more drama to come. The government is going to keep on using the Sherman Antitrust Act to bust up unions, which is going to continue to increase all of these bad feelings and tensions. When Eugene V. Debs gets out of prison, he's a little crazier than he was before, because now he's like, oh, the government is out to get me type of thing. So when he gets out, he's even more radical. He founds the American Socialist Party, and he'll eventually run for president on their platform. So now, overall, unions are just not going to be taken very seriously by anyone, and they're usually going to be associated with corruption and violence.